Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our session this morning. So the title today is Build It and They Won't Drive, Spatial Planning and Sustainable Travel. It's a really interesting topic, and we have a super knowledgeable group of experts to speak on this today. I've had a look behind the curtain and really excited about the insights that are going to be shared on this stage today. So my name is Georgia Yexley, and I'll be your chair for this session. I am a Como trustee board member for BikeShare and general manager for UK and Ireland at TIER, Europe's largest and climate neutral micromobility operator. So I am going to quickly do a run through of how we're going to manage this session. It is going to be interactive, so please do freely participate in the discussion. Also, for your awareness, there is a Q&A section. It is a toggle across from the chat box. You're going to be able to submit your questions there, and we will come to those after each two presentations. So the way that it will work today, we've got 4 different presentations to run through. I will introduce each speaker, their topic. They'll give a short presentation. We'll do that again, so twice over, and then have a short poll and Q&A, and then hopefully some additional time for a further Q&A across all 5 of our speakers today, if there is additional time. So without further ado, I will jump in with our first speaker. So I'm really pleased to introduce Anthony Downs, who's Estate Director at Gascoigne Estates. Anthony is Estates Director at Hatfield Park Estate in Hertfordshire. While Hatfield is rooted in history, the majority of Anthony's time is taken future-proofing the estate. So Anthony has been responsible for evolving the estate's attitudes to future growth and new development, not just in housing, but workspace, schools, community, and the wider infrastructure. And so Anthony will be providing insights into the opportunities and challenges for private developers in their efforts to introduce sustainable transport options. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Georgia, and good morning, everybody. I hope the tech is working, but without further ado, yes, build it and they won't drive. So a little bit of context. As Georgia has just intimated, I'm director at Hatfield. You might think, well, why is a rural estate interested in development? Well, a bit of the clue is in the right-hand side of this slide. We've got New Hatfield hard up against us, East Coast Main Line, literally a few hundred yards from our doorstep, and immediately to the north, Welwyn Garden City. So although we're rural, it's a surprisingly suburban part of the world. Bit of context, 8 out of 10 people live in urban areas, and it's notable that 63% of all trips in Hertfordshire are estimated to be under 5 miles. Most people own bikes. Very few people use them, however, to commute to work. And whilst you might think, well, with these stats and given the nature of existing housing in the area, it ought to be really straightforward to introduce better public transport and shared mobility. We are up against this kind of quote. This is a quote from a local councillor who will remain nameless, but this was a quote at a recent local plan hearing. And put quite simply, too many people in Hertfordshire are still attached to their private car. They still believe it is their right, and it's a perfectly good right. And why should they consider anything different? Shared mobility or public transport is in some way second rate. So how do we go about changing that attitude and proving that if alternatives are provided, not only can they be an alternative, but they can be a better alternative? So Gascoigne, or the estate here, are involved in promoting and hopefully delivering about 4,000 new homes, new workspace, schools, and all else that entails over a period which we estimate to be about 20 years. Now, when we set out, it was very clear that we didn't just want to replicate the kind of mass housing you see elsewhere, and we wanted to consider an environmental and sustainable approach. And we're going back 10 years, really, before these things were in any way fashionable. And we're determined to do things differently, to demonstrate the new development doesn't only have to be bad or unattractive, but that actually it is possible to embed new attitudes towards transport, workspace, etc., within these places. Quick canter through. We've got a number of sites, different sizes, different makeups. First is Creswick, southern edge of Welwyn Garden City. It's an urban extension, about 330 homes, relatively small amount of employment space, but well connected to the existing settlement. Secondly, and more excitingly, and also I should add perhaps more contentiously, we've got a new satellite village, Simonside, northwest of Hatfield. It's about 2 kilometres from the main sort of railway station. 1,500 homes, rather greater amount of employment space. And that is in itself, and you can see on this plan, just a kilometre north of Cooper's Green, which in itself is a further 1,750 homes and a rather greater 100,000 square feet of employment space. Now they're the sites, but what are our solutions? How do we actually persuade people that maintaining the status quo isn't simply a given? So the first is to try and drive modal shift via provision of amenities in sites themselves. So is it possible to shop and work and spend leisure time within these sites? It won't be the total answer, but it will be part of the mix. Similarly, we're very keen that there's a variety of house types and workspaces. So essentially, these sites provide a hierarchy of space for different incomes, different requirements, different points in the age spectrum. You can trade up, you can trade down, and hopefully, again, reduce trip generation. We know that there's strong demand, and we can also have a fairly unique marketing opportunity here, whereby we can essentially seek to establish a pioneering spirit, given the scale. We're going to essentially be providing homes and businesses for about 8,000 new residents. So can we build in, if we're going to incentivize active and sustainable travel, can we build it in from the outset? You'll perhaps be unsurprised that given our long-term nature, we're very keen on long-term stewardship. Can we ensure that these active travel measures aren't only there at the outset, but also provided for the long term? Can we ensure that long-term funding is available? We're looking at management companies, stewardship bodies. Can we embed sustainable transport within their terms of reference? We believe we can. And finally, it isn't one size fits all. It isn't simply going to be a question of a bus service or a car club. We strongly believe that there's a need for a hierarchy of options. So that might be a car club, it will be e-bikes, scooters, it will be demand response transport, as well as working with perhaps more conventional public transport operators alongside. We believe if there's a tenable alternative to the private car, then people will adopt it. And in many ways, this is plain to see in cities such as Cambridge, which have already embarked upon this journey and are delivering at far greater scale than we're even talking about here. There's the whole issue of design. All of our developments will be underpinned by a pattern book and properly master planned approach. It won't simply be your normal sort of standard cul-de-sacs and houses with front drives and gardens enabling people to park outside the front door. We want to make parking, if not impossible, then certainly more difficult. Similarly, the routes through, we have street hierarchies embedded in the master plans. Driving by car will take you longer. Walking and cycling will be safer and more attractive. And there's greater opportunity for getting from A to B more quickly. And then finally, it's not all about our developments, but it's also worth noting that routes to and from these developments may favour more sustainable alternatives. Therefore, again, sticking to your private car will take longer and be potentially more expensive. I think that basically summarises our approach. Clearly, I mean, you can go into huge detail here. It'd be possible to probably fill an hour, never mind 5 minutes. But look forward to hearing the next speaker and joining questions in due course. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Really insightful. And I think, I'm sure many of us have come up against those individually held opinions that can be blockers to, really being able to deliver sustainable transport options. And even to hark back to this morning with Richard calling on Minister Trudy Harrison to be bold, it does seem that, you're taking that on board in your approach, and it's something that kind of more widely across the private sector and the public sector we definitely need to take into account in delivering these. So thank you, Anthony. And with that in mind, it does work really well to kind of move over to Helen Foreman, who's the Urban Design Manager at West Yorkshire Combined Authority. So Helen is an architect and urban designer with a career spanning the public, private and third sectors, so you can give a really good insight across all three. Her decade in architectural practice was followed by a strategic role at the government's Homes and Communities Agency, where she promoted best practice and monitoring performance in housing design. Then at Leeds City Council, she focused on the link between design and health, working across directorates to improve the impacts of housing developments, particularly in children and older people, and has also researched the impact of residential street layout on children's independent play and mobility. And in her current role at West Yorkshire Combined Authority, she has, among many other things, been focused on the impact of urban design on women and girls. So Helen will be helping us to understand methods to ensure people across all demographics are properly included in the public realm. So without further ado, over to you, Helen. Really looking forward to this presentation.
Thanks, Georgia. Yes, I've termed the design urban design and inclusion, but it does really focus on women and children for various reasons. Women and children move around our neighbourhoods and cities in different ways. We can't keep doing what we're doing. We'll just get what we've always got, which is considerable inequality for women and girls. They're underrepresented in public space. They're sometimes afraid to use it. And children are literally disappearing from our streets. They're not using it in the same, using the streets in the same way as they were. Something to just think about first and bear in mind during this presentation is this graph, which shows very interesting statistics on women in industry, and down right at the bottom of the proportion of women in industry, you can see construction and transport and storage. And these are 2014 statistics, not much better in 2019, 21% of the transport sector and 12.5% of the construction workforce. So that's kind of where I've come from. Things are getting better, but not fast enough. So just something to bear in mind. This is a very interesting graph, which you might have seen before by Inés Sánchez de Madariaga, who shows how women use transport. You can see down the left the typical categories that help us design our transport systems. Trips are divided up into different categories, but what Madariaga's done is shown in red there the number of trips that are likely to be made as sort of care-related trips, which are predominantly carried out by women. And if you add all those together, you get the graph on the right, which shows that care-related work is a very, very close second to employment in the way people use transport. And that's important because those care trips don't work the same way as employment trips. This graph here, or this chart here, shows the typical, it could be any city transport network, but it shows this concept of radial planning really well. So radial planning is basically based on the breadwinner, usually male, and disadvantages those with more varied journeys, women, children and older people who tend to make trip chains. So women will drop off their children at school, then they will go to a shop, and then they will go to work, and then they will go somewhere else. And then those trips are not made up of these very, very straightforward in and out routes. So what we're doing at the Combined Authority is we're starting a demand responsive bus trial where people can get the bus to go where they want to go, and that's just in a pilot stage, and we're really excited about where that might lead. Another, obviously, an important issue about women and the way they move around is related to safety. These statistics show that this is just how frightening it is for women to use public transport, and those statistics are not different from, you know, the UK and West Yorkshire examples where I'm from. They're similar. So another thing we're doing at the Combined Authority is looking at how we might help that. And so we applied to the Home Office for the Safety of Women at Night Fund and won that bid. And we're using that not just to help make the environment safer for women, but also to try and raise awareness and start some behavioural change in men, and encouraging bystanders to become active upstanders. Another important issue is physical activity. There are inequalities for women and men, and especially for girls. Those are pie charts that you can see, which show that women aren't getting the physical activity they need. So the green is people getting the physical activity they need. You can see how that goes down to a very, very small slice for girls, and it's not just girls and children, it's also older people. For disabled people, you can halve that, but also there are economic, geographic and racial factors in there too, and it's mental as well as physical activity. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to change what we do. This is a really useful chart, graphic as well, which shows a family of 4 generations and their roaming range, so their independent mobility as a child. And the very, very big area there shows how the great-grandfather in 1919 was allowed to walk 6 miles to go fishing, and the very, very tiny dot on the left is the son who now, probably about 10 years ago when this graph was done, is only allowed to walk to the end of the street. So that in the last, well, you can see from the mother's at the top, her area of independent mobility, and the son is in the last 50 years. And that's the time where we've doubled the number of cars. So, you know, doesn't take a genius to kind of work out what's going on there. The things that influence the way that children move around, they do move around differently to everyone else. They're great because they can't drive, so we can look at, you know, they are compelled to be pedestrians, and they move around slightly differently to other people. They are always looking for kind of walking loops. They like to move around, but they like to stay very close to home. They're always looking for where their friends are playing. They are influenced obviously by traffic, so they will not be able to, there are severance issues that prevent them going to where they need to go. And they need lots of different play opportunities, because if there are other children playing out there, there is a certain dynamic between groups of children that they need lots of opportunities. So there's lots of things to do. And something that's been done to try to encourage children's play, or everyone's social interaction really, is home zones, which have been kind of quite successful in limiting vehicle speeds and prioritizing the pedestrian. You can see from these graphs here, so at the top it shows that home zones and the way they influence children's behavior. I'm not sure if you can read it, but kind of the hanging out is in the dark blue. So much more sort of hanging around, people watching and just moving around is done in the home zones, as compared to sort of more traditional street design, which is shown at the bottom. Another interesting thing to note is that where you have children playing, you often have adults too, and it sort of works in that way that kind of the children, there are more of them playing out, but where they are, adults tend to follow. So, and it's also this sort of phrase, children as an indicator species, that you might have heard used, and that means that places that are good for children are good for everyone. That the visible presence of children without their parents in numbers is a sort of sign of health of that human habitat, just like the presence of salmon in a river is a sign of health of that habitat too. Just kind of moving on. Oh no, I think I've skipped one. In terms of a mandate for equality, we do have one. We have the Social Value Act and we have the Equality Act, and we have the National Planning Policy Framework in this country that's really encouraging an equal view of a view of equality and inclusion in the way that we design. So that is something that we can we can use to justify building in this way. And I just wanted to finish with an inspirational quote from Jane Jacobs, who's my urban design hero. She was an activist, journalist, intellectual, and urbanist. I've already heard somebody quoting her today. She coined that phrase, "eyes on the street," and I think she told us so much, and what she wrote is still so relevant, especially in talking about women's freedom and what makes streets safe and what makes people hang out in them. So highly recommend looking her up if you haven't already heard of her. And that's me.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Helen. And by all means, please do share any links to good reading. I'm definitely going to be doing some reading up on Jane Jacobs. I thought that quote was absolutely fantastic. So we are going to move now to a short poll for the audience so that we can get a bit of a temperature check on what everybody is thinking, having kind of come off the back of these two really interesting presentations, both from the private and public sector. We're now asking you kind of what will encourage the public to choose a home without a private car parking space. And I can see already in the Q&A that a lot of people are talking in this direction in terms of limiting private car parking. But it's quite clear here the temperature that we have in the audience being that quality alternatives to the car is 100% of the votes so far, and what is really going to drive us towards enabling people on sustainable transport. So thank you for the participation, and it keeps on going up, more votes for the same section. So I think the temperature is clear in the audience today, and we'll move now to Q&A. I think no doubt around this subject matter. And I should point out, actually, we did have somebody there, maybe one or two people voting that actually removing the option for car parking was the way forward. And in that vein, actually, one of the questions that we do have from our audience today, the first being, we need to make sure housing developments include bike share, bus transport and car share in the planning, if allowed, and do not build car parks. So if I can build on that for our panelists, what would that look like? How would that work in practice? And what's the role of the public sector versus the private sector in making that happen?
Okay, I can go first if you like. I thought the poll was interesting, and I can see why people voted the way they did, because obviously you need to get around. There is no other way to convince people to do that other than quality alternatives to the car. The other ways to vote were all sort of byproducts and interesting kind of bonuses from not having cars. I think it is a really, really difficult problem, one which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is how to kind of get that street space back. That, I talked about children's independent mobility, and I'm quite old now, so I played out in the 1970s where there were half as many cars as there are now. That street space belonged to us as children, and cars had to wait for us to stop skipping and then move along the street, because things, that proportion has changed, and I think we do need to get back to that smaller number of cars, and you can do that using clever design. You obviously do need to have the public transport links nearby, but you can. I mean, I talked about home zones as one way that's been done, and they were really successful in getting that street space back. But the cars do need to go somewhere, and it all depends on a really, really good public transport service, or the ability to access good cycle and walking links.
Thank you, Helen. And Anthony, I can see you something to add from the private side.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what Helen's just said. I mean, certainly design can go a long way. Street hierarchies, for example, different widths, different design techniques, no parking on certain frontages, all of those things can go a long way. That said, and I think in terms of providing everybody with a bit of a prod, I think planning authorities could look at parking standards, and time and again, we're actually wanting to reduce parking standards, but when it goes to the vote at the planning committee, Local councillors can be very concerned about local residents and their views on the doorstep, and therefore design is affected more by the electoral timetable than perhaps by what we should be genuinely seeking to provide in the future. So there's a balance there. I mean, developers can do so much. We've got to work in partnership, public and private, and we can both do our bit.
I should mention as well, sorry, Georgia, but I've just thought about a report that I often quote, which is called Space to Park by Urbed, which looked at the way parking's organised. So they found, in looking at an estate in Kent, a housing estate, that lots of spaces weren't being used, and they found that lots more were being overused. So in using more unallocated parking space, they could use this same number of spaces for cars more efficiently. People don't like unallocated parking. They like to know where they can park their car, but some people don't own a car, whereas other families have 5. So the way that you can, if you can convince people to have unallocated parking, then that is a much more efficient way of making that work. And then that frees up those, you get people really, really frustrated and angry over neighborhood parking. It can cause, unbelievable disquiet between neighbors. And if you eliminate that, you also kind of build that community, avoid those arguments and build a stronger community because of it. So that's a really interesting report to look at.
Yeah, certainly. And thanks for continuing to share really insightful resources, Helen, and hopefully we'll be able to share some links to some of those in the chat. I think both of you there have also touched on really interesting elements of this discussion that lead quite nicely to another question from the audience. Anthony, you mentioned hierarchy of different modes. And Helen, you've talked about the kind of different accessibility questions that need to come in our decision making. One of the audience members has suggested that we withdraw kind of implementing garages into parking and only support those that have the potential for EV charging. So that's even bringing in maybe specific types of vehicles where people do need them. Then let's lead them towards more sustainable options. Helen, I'll go straight to you because that was a clear response.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. But garages they're so small often when they're built that people can't fit the cars in them, and the houses are built without enough storage really for what a lot of people use. So they use the garage for really, really inefficient storage. It's not a good way to store belongings in a big car-shaped space. And then they'll convert that garage, and then it's really poorly insulated extra room. I would argue for a greater storage, and then get that space back. Because what that is counted as a parking space in the planning authority's calculations, but that car doesn't go in that garage. It goes out on the street, possibly partially on the pavement, and it's ruining that street environment. So yeah, I do have a bit of a thing about garages. I can't believe I didn't mention it, but yeah, don't get me started. Well, they could be bigger. They need to be bigger so that they, if you do need one, then it works for your car. Sorry.
Go ahead, Anthony.
Shall I dive in on the end of that? I mean, I completely agree about space standards and storage. I'm a real bugbear about that. What I often term the sort of the Hoover and ironing board test, as much as anything else. Houses often have woefully inadequate storage. And our experience absolutely echoes what you say. Probably 80% of garages are used for some alternative use other than parking a car. All I would say is that comes back again to a sort of design-led approach. I think garages can have a use, they can have a benefit, but also we should be thinking about them more than simply a place to park a car. Can they be incorporated in a way, for example, that they can be flexible space, either elderly care, given our experience of the last 2 years, home office space, which is divorced from your main living space to provide some degree of separation between the two. I mean, it's another area we could talk extensively about, but it's certainly worthy of examination. And I don't personally see any future in substandard sort of low grade box ticking type garage provision. I think we should be moving away from that.
Brilliant. Thank you for those inputs, Anthony. And certainly we will have hopefully more opportunity to also bring our other speakers today into this discussion. Maybe we can continue some focus on garages. And I should say we're seeing a huge number of really insightful questions come through from the audience. We are going to move on to our next speakers, but the hope is that we can then bring Helen and Anthony back in at the end as well, if we have time for a joint Q&A session. So we'll come back to some of these questions. But thank you both for those insights and the resources that are being shared, and hopefully speak with you again very shortly. All right, thank you both. So we'll be moving on now to our third speaker today, James Cox, who's a development manager at Town. So James is dual qualified in urban design, is a chartered town planner, and is working as the development manager at Town, where he heads a number of projects pushing the dial away from car ownership towards other means of travel. And we'll be hearing about some of those exciting projects today. So over to you, James.
Thanks, Georgia, for the introduction. Certainly some really interesting presentations and questions so far, and a lot of those themes that we've just been talking about, I'll touch on again in my presentation, definitely. So as Georgia said, I'm development manager at Town, kind of chartered planner and urban designer by background as well, and previously worked in London and Birmingham, and now working nationwide with a particular focus on Milton Keynes and Cambridge. I'm going to be talking about how, as a developer, we can try and make the sustainable transport options that we've been talking about the default in new developments, and how we as a company are doing that across our projects. So a bit about Town. We were founded in 2014. There's now 10 of us working nationwide, work at 3 different scales of projects. First of which is neighbourhood housing, working with kind of local community groups and co-housing groups and custom builders to deliver out their dreams and aspirations on small sites. We do town centre regeneration projects where we'll do direct delivery, mix of uses, sustainable regeneration, looking at different policy outcomes. And then lastly, we work as a master developer as well, forming kind of new parts of towns and cities. Includes setting a vision, obtaining planning, and delivering key infrastructure. And today I'm going to talk about the lessons we learn and how we apply them across their different scales. So Marmalade Lane has already been flashed up today in Helen's presentation, was our first built scheme in 2018, sorry. It's 42 home co-housing scheme, which means it's an intentional community for a co-housing group, in this case K1 co-housing, where residents have their own house in addition to some shared facilities. Based in Cambridge on the kind of northern edge, in an urban extension called Orchard Park, very much a kind of edge of settlement location, and we've ended up with quite a different scheme to the rest of the urban extension. We were selected as the preferred developer in 2015 by the council, who are a landowner, and the co-housing group, and worked to their brief. We worked really closely with the residents as well, as you'll see, to who now kind of design and manage their site. So one of the key moves in the master plan was to prioritise people over cars, and we did that by providing a much lower parking requirement than as the standard said from the local authority. So we're about 1 space per dwelling plus an additional 0.1 for visitors. Interestingly, the co-housing group have since put in another planning application to further reduce their car parking needs. So they're now down to about 0.8 spaces overall, and they've been able to kind of transform some of the kind of informal parking areas that we set out in the application into additional shared gardens. The group really actively manage their own transport, which is fantastic. So they have their own electric vehicle car club. They have their own e-cargo bike scheme. And again, this helped to reduce the amount of spaces that we had to provide within the application. And we were able to free that space up within the master plan as well. So if you look at those pictures at the top, you'll see on the right is Marmalade Lane with the kind of parking area and vehicle movement area hatched out in blue. And then on the left is the plot immediately opposite in Orchard Park, which has a far higher proportion of space for vehicles and parking. And in Marmalade Lane, we were able to use it for shared open spaces. You'll see the big garden, the shared lane, whereas in Orchard Park, it was just vehicle parking. So there's a few key transport lessons coming out of Marmalade Lane. Really the value of working with future customers to strengthen the planning case. We're able to go to the planners and say, look, we're working with the future residents and they don't want to have a garage and they don't want to have 2 car parking spaces, especially one which is right outside the front of their house. We were able to kind of prove to estate agents that maybe residents don't value the garage and they don't value the space, and instead they'd like other spaces that they can use within the site. And crucially, the kind of balance between private space and shared space and how we divide that up. And Marmalade Lane has been kind of widely recognised across the industry as being a leading example. Taking that up to a next scale, we looked at how we can apply the lessons of Marmalade Lane to our scheme in Wolverton, which is in Milton Keynes. It's a 115 home build-to-rent mixed-use scheme, which also includes a co-housing group in Milton Keynes. Wolverton, for those that know it or don't, is an old railway town, born way before Milton Keynes was even an idea, with a really strong street grid compared to the kind of the wider roundabout-led grid of Milton Keynes. Working on a 1.2 hectare site in the town centre, which is currently a shopping centre and a free town centre car park, sandwiched between the 2 kind of commercial areas in the town. Has a really tight grid of streets, backways, outbuildings, and a really nice kind of red brick character. It's definitely already a 15-minute city, which certainly has a lot of benefits for us, but also it has some parking problems in the wider town as well. So we worked with the local community to bring forward the scheme. The big moves within the scheme were adding to that kind of mixed-use town centre, so adding shops, adding new public realm, reinstating roads, creating car-free little streets like the one you can see on the left-hand side, and a pocket park. We looked to improve the bus stopping arrangements within the scheme. We've added 2 different types of bike hire schemes, one for kind of more day-to-day, one for commuter. We're going to have 4 new car clubs spaces within the scheme as well, which are open to all, and residents will get a kind of moving impact with vouchers to those facilities. We over-provided the number of cycle parking, but again, under-provided the number of residential spaces, which was quite a big battle. And these will be leased on a monthly basis with discounts for those with electric vehicles or affordable housing residents, and they'll be enforced through the tenancy agreements as well. So we feel like this will be a scheme where it's very natural to live without a car. Thinking about the key lessons, working with future residents really matters. Again, being able to say, look, this is what people want was fantastic and really helped our kind of argument. There was a grey area in what happens beyond the parking standards when parking standards don't apply or aren't envisaged to be applied by the policy. What happens? What kind of data do we go to? What do highways look to? It was a real kind of area of confusion, and that's why evidence by kind of Coma UK is really helpful in seeing, like, okay, a car club accounts for, say, 6 vehicles, 7 vehicles. There was a need for flexibility within the determination period, thinking about whether we needed to have a kind of clause in section 106 about a controlled parking zone, which would cover a lot of the town and mean that our new residents wouldn't be able to add to kind of existing issues. And then a kind of question of perilousness of planning committee, and what weighs more, is it what highways are saying, or what the urban designer officer is saying, or what happens if there's not a sustainability officer and the climate emergency kind of falls down the scale. And then at the top end, and really looking into the future, we're working on a site in northeast Cambridge and thinking about how we can apply these lessons from smaller schemes and town centre schemes up to big master developer led schemes. So we're working with U&I alongside our landowners, Cambridge City Council and Anglian Water, on their site at northeast Cambridge by Cambridge North Station, where the wastewater treatment plant will be relocated, bringing forward a scheme for 5,500 new homes and other uses in a truly kind of mixed-use neighbourhood. Timescales are very different on this, owing to the stage of the project, and I don't think it's going to be finished by 2043, by which time I'll be a lot older. But the site affords some real opportunities. So being of such a scale, it has the kind of ambition and opportunity to really push the needle on what the future of transport is and how that relates to sustainability. The site is constrained, and the trip budgets kind of suggest so. So whilst we might normally be arguing for reduced car parking, in this case, we're at 0.2 spaces per dwelling anyway in a really high density scheme. Having to think again about different land use budgets, we've opted for a strategy where we'll be pooling cars into what we're calling neighbourhood hubs, which will be a mixture of kind of car barns and mobility hubs with different modes, which then frees up additional space for landscaping. Thinking carefully about the provision of alternative modes and infrastructures when delivering a scheme of this size with this little kind of amount of car parking. What does that mean for the streets? Like, we need a new street hierarchy that promotes e-cargo bikes for deliveries that's away from maybe somewhere where people are walking because of different speeds and different needs. And also having to think into the future and working out kind of who our future customers are, in the same way that we had an existing group at Marmalade Lane and we were working with the community in Wolverton. We need to do the same in Cambridge and think about their needs. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Really insightful and great to hear about these projects. A lot of exciting stuff happening across cities that I'm definitely going to be following up with you on. But it's what I definitely picked out there as well, was where Anthony has kind of given the example of personal opinion forming a barrier. The kind of community consultation that featured throughout those projects just really does demonstrate how public opinion can also help build towards the right solution. So I think an interesting debate ahead, no doubt, on how public opinion can be influenced or shaped both to the positive and negative impact on sustainable transport. So thank you, James, and we will move quickly on to a really interesting kind of collaboration here from both Alan and Robert. So Alan Simpson is a senior planner at Aberdeen City Council, and Robert Chopin is the partnerships manager at Co-Wheels. So both will be presenting together today and demonstrating that cross collaboration between the private public sector. Alan has within his team, he's worked there since 2007. The management of the city's car club is one of the projects that he's been involved with since 2012. The car club fits in really well with the city's mission to encourage mode shift away from the private car. And there's a stat here that both will discuss in a little bit more detail, that the car club, one car club vehicle can replace up to 17 private ones. And from Robert's side, he's the partnership manager at Co-Wheels. So he's been with the car club more than 4 years and previously worked in marketing and PR in the further education and local government sectors. So can no doubt bring in that aspect of shaping and using public opinion, but also started life as a regional journalist covering politics and motoring. So really interesting backgrounds, but very keen to get into the thick of this kind of cross collaboration. So over to you both.
You're on mute, Robert.
Robert, sorry, we've still got you on mute there, I'm afraid. Do you want to just try unmuting for us?
Apologies for that.
No worries, thank you.
Yes, sorry about that. I'll just quickly explain who Co-Wheels are. We're a national car club who've been in business more than 12 years, operating as a social enterprise. We have 600 cars from Orkney in the north to the Isle of Wight and many of the cities in between. Just last week, we won the Green Fleet Mobility Provider of the Year for our work on rolling out EVs. And this presentation, we've heard from developers like Gascoigne Estates who choose to put car clubs into developments, but what we're looking at is those that come in as part of the statutory process through funding known as Section 106 in England and Wales and Section 75 in Scotland. So we work across the UK, but Aberdeen is a really good example for us of how to do it well in a joined up way. In many of the areas we work in, it can be quite ad hoc. We're often approached at the end of development by the developers once it's all built, and then you look at the area. Yeah, you see it's really in the wrong location. It's the wrong housing type. It's already got the wrong parking ratios, and really to work, car share has to be built in, not bolt on. And the difference with Aberdeen is not only that the local authority has very clear guidance, as is set out here on this slide, but it also manages that process quite actively. It acts as the liaison between the developer and the car club, and also manages the funding. Some of the outline details are set out there, but as that guidance says, any development over 3 dwellings is pulled into the scheme, or where parking is constrained, and it works on that basis. As Georgia says, we look to introduce 1 car club vehicle for every 17 spaces. So for the details, I'll now hand over to Alan and the next slide.
Thank you, Robert. So as Robert says, yes, I work for Aberdeen City Council. As previous presentations have said, yeah, we see there's a whole list of different transport initiatives that we can use to try and encourage this mode shift away from the private car. But I think giving people that sort of knowledge that they've still got access to a car is still quite important. And that's something that we've tried to build in to part of our sort of mobility mix, basically. So as part of our local development plan, we have standards for transport for new developments, and Car Club is very much written into those standards in a very transparent way. So we've got 4 key areas that we look at. We've broken it down into small developments of up to 50 units that have an existing Car Club vehicle within 400 metres. We've got the small developments up to 50 units with no Car Club vehicle within 400. We've got large developments, 50 units or more with an existing Car Club vehicle within 400 metres. And we've then got the largest developments with no Car Club vehicle within 400 metres. And there's different criteria that we've got for each one. And next slide, please, Robert. So for the smaller developments, where there's a shortfall of parking and an existing vehicle within 400 metres, the first thing we do is we check if the Car Club vehicle can actually accommodate extra users from a new development. So we check that with the Car Club operator themselves. If so, the developer contributes £400 for every unit with a parking shortfall in that development. And they'll basically get back in return 2 memberships for each household, 2 allowances of driving credit for each household, and that's provided by the Car Club to those residents. The Car Club can also use part of that contribution if they want to help sustain the vehicle, or to fund an additional one if they think, well, we're almost at the tipping point, we want to bring another vehicle into that area. That contribution is going to help us do it. If we're in an area where there's a shortfall of parking in a small development and there's not a vehicle within 400 metres, or it's at capacity, the Car Club can then take that contribution and they can use it towards a new vehicle if they want to. And then the process is the same as above. They will then give memberships to the residents in that development. And next slide, please. For large developments, it's a bit different. So there's a shortfall of parking and we've got an existing vehicle within 400 metres. Again, we check with the Car Club if that vehicle can accommodate those extra users from that development. Contributions are then taken if so, and again, the Car Club will provide the memberships and the driving credit as before. However, there is no capacity. Rather than just giving a contribution, the developer has to fund a new vehicle for that development. And where there's a shortfall of parking and there's no vehicle within 400 metres already, the developer has to fund a new vehicle just outright, absolutely. If there's more than a 17 space shortfall, the developer must then fund an additional vehicle. So we could have 2, possibly even 3 vehicles funded in some developments sometimes. And again, that's based on the fact that we reckon that one Car Club car can replace up to 17, or sorry, one Car Club car can replace up to 17 private cars. When a new vehicle is funded by a development, the car club will then determine what's the most appropriate vehicle to go into that space. So we'll have that dialogue with them. The vehicle must be funded for 3 years by the developer, because we reckon it gives the car club car long enough to prove itself. If after 3 years it's working, great, the car club aren't taking on a risky car. And if after 3 years it doesn't work, then, well, they've tried and the car can be taken away. If an EV is selected by the car club as the most appropriate vehicle, the developer then must provide the charge point for that EV and also provide access to it as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of financial management, the developer pays the council the full amount of the Section 75 payment, the legal agreement as part of the planning application. When the building work begins on site, the council will then contract the car club to provide the vehicle before completion. So that allows the car club to work with the developer to roll out the new memberships via resident information packs and engage with them early. If the development does not take place within the 5-year consent, when the planning permission expires, then the contribution is returned to the developer. So basically, we'll have to wait until development starts before we can actually pay that contribution to the car club. If new vehicles are being funded, then the contribution has to be paid in full at the start and not drip fed over 3 years. That's because the car club will usually fund a vehicle with a lease for 3 years up front. And we want to get the vehicle in there basically from the off so that we've got the greatest chance of converting the largest number of households over to the car club. If there's more than one vehicle going into development, we can stagger them. We can have trigger points where maybe the second vehicle comes in, but we need to have the vehicle there from the start. And I'll say if after 3 years the vehicle's not being used, then at present the car club don't have to continue with it. Next slide, please. So successes in future. Well, since 2017, it's now actually over £270,000 has been paid to the car club from 43 planning applications, and that's funded 8 cars and it's funded many memberships. Our next local development plan, so our land use plan, is due for adoption in 2022, and again, we're going to have car club standards built into that guidance. We're planning to keep the car club requirement in, and we're keen to introduce some new requirements for developments over a certain size to automatically incorporate a car club. So we have like a master plan site with about 350 homes. Then I think we're going to start asking for a car club to be built into that as part of the transport mix. We'll also have to investigate if one car club car equaling 17 spaces needs amended. Is that still the right stat? But I think by having this in the future, it's likely to lead to far more funded EVs and charge points as well, given that there's far more of a push towards trying to basically phase out the need for petrol and diesel cars by 2030 in Scotland. So I think it's going to lead to a lot more EV car club cars and charge points. And next slide, please. And I'll hand back to Robert to talk about a couple of examples.
Thanks very much, Alan. That's great. Yeah, as Alan has explained, it is a very comprehensive scheme with very clear guidance. And so there's some examples here of where we've been able to provide not just cars, but also vans where appropriate. That first example with student accommodation, where we often find there's ready demand for people who want larger vehicles, estates or vans where they can actually move all their equipment belongings in and out again, usually at the end of the year. Private flats is another example, and what the Aberdeen scheme has enabled us to do, I think it's unique outside of London, is that by funding contributions towards cars, not just for those smaller developments, not those that would justify a whole car, it's enabled us to grow the club much beyond the sort of urban core where you'd expect it to be. As we all know, those who work in the business, only 1% of the population overall actually actively participate in car share. So we're still trying to get to the other 99%. And this has allowed us to expand beyond those who are immediately open to car share and broaden it out. As I know one speaker said in the very first session this morning, car share will operate anyway on its own without any encouragement. But if you do actively encourage it, it will go faster to a great extent into new areas. And that, I think, is the lesson we've learned from Aberdeen. It's made it both more sustainable in the central area, but it's also enabled us to broaden it out into a much broader range of housing types. Which brings us neatly on to this example here within social housing. Car share is often vital for those that may not be able to afford a car and certainly not afford an EV. One of our key target groups are younger people who are on below average salaries, tend to live in social housing, And if they do own the car, the stats show that it's more than 10 years old, so it's usually unreliable, very expensive, and dirty in environmental terms. But by getting into those social housing developments, it enables us to open it up to that audience and get them into a cleaner car. Charging infrastructure, I think, going forward is going to be key to expanding zero-emission car share. More than 50% of our cars in Aberdeen are EV, and in the past, the Scottish government has funded a lot of that charge infrastructure. But in future, constraints on public funding are such that we see Section 75 as being one of the key ways to enable more of that charge infrastructure to be installed, so that we can switch existing cars over to EV where possible. That's it from our point of view, unless there are any queries and questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you both. And I have some burning questions myself, but I'm going to try and hold back until we go through our poll and then go on to our Q&A. But I'll just call out, Robert, that I loved that phrase, built in, not bolt on. I think that will definitely be taken forward for a number of people here today. So we will go to the next poll. And just a reminder, if you're struggling to see it, if you close the questions, you will see the poll there and be able to vote. And I think it's maybe slightly an unfair framing, given the discussion so far has had a real common thread of the private, public, and even third sector collaboration. But we're asking who can make the most difference in the shift to reduce car dependency. So be that national government, planning authorities, developers and landowners, operators, or the public. Okay, so we've got a number of votes coming through and split at the moment between government and planning authority, but certainly leaning towards the public sector. The general public, yes, I agree. I think the general public have to come along on this. And I think, yeah, we've got developers and landowners. So no doubt we're going to see a good balance across a number of these areas. And what's really interesting here is we haven't yet got a vote for operators. I think operators play a really important role, but in terms of making the most difference towards shifting car dependency, maybe they are the solution providers rather than those that are able to really shift the frameworks that have been discussed today, or public opinion, etc. So I think we do play a large role, but we can see that that's maybe more on the delivery side from those in the poll today. So, okay, thank you very much. So we definitely landing there with a focus on the planning authority. Maybe that's off the back of the discussion that we've had so far. So we'll introduce James, Alan and Robert back onto the stage to do a short Q&A, and then possibly extend out to Helen and Anthony shortly after, because we do have a good bit of time to be able to get through some of these questions, which is great. But I am going to take the opportunity to ask my burning question for Alan and Robert, and hopefully it will be helpful for the audience here today. I think we've got quite a broad group of attendees. So what I'm interested in immediately, I think those that know me will know I speak quite frankly on the financial sustainability element being an important aspect of sustainable travel or transport, fully fulfilling that title of being sustainable. So my mind immediately goes to how learnings from the framework that have been developed for car clubs that enable that private funding stream for shared mobility might extend to other forms of transport outside of the motor vehicle, EVs as it may be, to things like light electric vehicles and broader forms of transport.
Yeah, do you want me to take that one first?
Please.
Yeah, I would totally agree. As well as having the car club requirement built into our local development plan, we've also got one for EV charge points now as well. So we've got EV charging standards basically in there for new developments. And again, that puts the onus back on the developer to make sure they're providing a certain standard, a certain ratio depending on what they're building, and making sure, exactly like Robert says, it's built in, not bolt on. So the idea that they've got the power requirement basically there right at the start of the development, rather than having to sort of retrofit everything in. So as I say, the onus is then put back on the developer as part of their planning conditions to make sure they do that. In terms of bike share, yeah, I think we see that as working very similarly to potentially a car club model like we have in Aberdeen. We recently signed a partnership actually with a bike share operator to come into Aberdeen for the first time. So they are due to launch in 2022 around springtime. So I think we're quite keen just to see how it develops, first of all, in terms of the sort of the public uptake, in terms of which sites are popular. But I think there might be scope to potentially start to do something with that in the future as well.
I think from our point of view, I mean, we can operate car share without financial support in most areas, but we're only going to be able to operate in the prime areas. And you know that for the first 9 months or so, you might be sustaining a loss before you can actually turn it to become sustainable or even make a profit, which is where this support through schemes like Section 10675 enables us to actually broaden it and make it more sustainable in a shorter period. So it just it helps support the whole network. And from our point of view, although I've only talked about car share, really it is vital that there is also good public transport and other forms of sharing, good cycle routes, good walking routes, to make it really feasible to not own a car or have to own a car. When I said there's nothing more depressing when we get a Section 106 application and you look at it and it's an outer fringe estate, there are no shops nearby, there's no good public transport, there are no cycle or walking routes. You really have to have a car but own a car to even live there. And you know that if you attempted to put a car in that location, you'd just be facing flat batteries for the first 6 months, because they've all got double garages and large drives. So, which is why it's not just funding, but also the design as well at the very beginning of it, and making sure that funding is available for good public transport and other forms of mobility, which then, so when people do need a car, they can just switch to the car. But the other mobility has got to be in there first.
Yeah, I think that is a really important view of it not being about kind of one single area, but that broader public transport mix and thinking across the board. And perhaps that's actually reflective of the poll that we just did in the responses that we had, where the most opportunity sits with the public authority. Perhaps that is because they have the most access across, or ability to influence across, all forms of transport in a particular region. Maybe that's something to hear from you, James, about in terms of the poll results that we saw, and whether you feel that that's kind of reflective of the level of influence that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, from our experiences working with numerous local authorities, if the rules are there and the rules are good, then very, very happy to kind of play along, because at the end of the day, you're going to get a better scheme as a result, and it's going to have better kind of outcomes for everyone involved. Thinking about, if you're having to carve off half of your site to be a car park, then is that the best use of that land? As a developer, no, it's not. You still got to buy that land, even though there's very limited kind of value attributed to it, which isn't that helpful. And if you're able to kind of condense the space down from 17 spaces to one car club, then as I kind of said in my presentation, think of all of the good that you can do with that space instead, whether that's kind of public realm improvements or larger kind of shared gardens. It's all there. But I think everyone has a role to play. Developers definitely do. National government kind of sets the agenda to an extent, but really I think it's a local level where those rules can be established, as we've just heard about in Aberdeen.
No, very much agreed. And I think, up to this point, our discussion has been maybe a little bit philosophical, but actually each of you have given real practical insights into the projects that you're running that have been successful in these areas. So one of the questions that we have from the audience is more on the practical side, and how each of you have been able to kind of deliver these projects, and whether it was difficult, or if you can speak on maybe some of the challenges in terms of, and I think this is particularly maybe starting with yourself, Alan, some of the challenges in getting that senior level buy-in and support to be able to take these projects forward. If there's practical advice that you can share with our audience here.
Yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing was just when we first started getting involved with the car club, no one in Aberdeen really knew what a car club was. It was sort of quite a new concept for up here. I think Edinburgh had one, Glasgow had just launched one, but it was kind of selling the benefit of, well, actually, yes, the people do still need access to cars. So let's try and find a way of doing it, which can then bring wider benefits to the city as well. So it's the idea of, we know a lot of cars, private ones, will spend most of their time parked. I think it's something like 94% of the time that they're actually there, they basically spend parked. So we're able to say, well, we've got wider sort of desires to effectively do more with the public realm in the city centre. Then if we can encourage more people to go for a car club car, then that can cut down the amount of private parking, and far more space can be given over to people, which is exactly what I suppose the bosses, the politicians were kind of wanting to do in terms of encouraging more people into the city centre. It fitted very nicely with, I think, our ambitions around sort of improving air quality as well. And I suppose less cars meant less polluted air. But also the idea of, if we're trying to encourage a transition over to electric vehicles, over to hydrogen vehicles, then it worked very, very well in terms of people kind of got the opportunity to try the technology, and they got to try it in an everyday sort of situation. And it meant that they weren't scared by it anymore. They could see it working for them. But rather than people previously thinking, oh, if I want an electric car, I've got to go out and buy one. If I want a hydrogen car, I've got to go out and buy one. You could say, well, actually, I can join a car club, and that gives me access to one when I need one, but also a whole suite of different vehicles that are then more appropriate to my circumstances, depending on which journey I'm doing. So I think selling the idea that it could fit with a lot of different councils or priorities was a really, really big one for us. But also it's helped us internally too. We used to run our own fleet of pool cars at Aberdeen City Council, and it was our little transport team that ran around after them, jump-starting them when the batteries went flat and things. So I think being able to say, yes, we can still have a pool car service, but we can get the car club to manage it for us, was a big win for us as well. Because again, it freed us up to do our job more, but at the same time, we could still have that service provided by, basically a more experienced operator. And I think, again, the idea of building the car club into the development management process fitted very nicely, again, with the long-term plan of the city of, let's discourage people from having to own a car, with, well, kind of fitting with the whole sort of mode share, mode shift kind of idea, of, again, giving them this access to a car when they needed one without them having to have their own private one, sort of sitting around gathering dust, costing them money and taking up space that didn't need to be there ultimately. So, I think building it in with the wider principles definitely helped.
Yeah, I think this is sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of practical constraints, one of the things that we run back to base, and actually getting a physical car club bay and getting it in the right location where it's going to work is often one of the big key challenges, because parking constraints are one of the key indicators of a good area for car share. So where it's difficult to own a car because you can't actually park it is actually where we want to be. But then if you want to put a fixed bay in there, then that can be a lengthy process. You've got to advertise it, listen to any legal challenges before and objections from residents before you can actually get it established. And once you've got it established, then it's a big commitment that you've got to make sure it's in the right place, because it takes so long to get it there. That's one of the reasons why we've sort of developed a virtual hub system where we can just geofence an area, which allows us to sort of quickly set up hubs without a mini virtual bay without a physical bay there. So that makes it more flexible. I know some of the other questions that have been asked about us tying in with other operators like the bus companies, First and Stagecoach. Well, we have actually tied in with Go Ahead Group, one of the other bus operators, to do a shared card, so that that smart card operates as both your bus pass, and you can load credit on it for a bus pass, but also it's your Co-Wheels membership card as well, and we give them a discount if they sign up for both. So yes, we are working with other bus operators.
Cross collaboration is vital, and I think this would be a great opportunity to kind of bring Anthony and Helen back into the conversation as well, because there are some common threads that in our earlier discussions we've brought out, but I think in the presentations and the questions that we're seeing as well are coming through. So if we can invite Helen and Anthony back into the discussion as well, I think they'll have some great insights to hear. But I think what we're seeing through the commentary there, Alan, Robert, through the presentations, is a real call to build this in from the outset, whether that is, enabling demonstration of new technology so that the adoption can come, or the engagement side in consultation that James spoke about, or really thinking about very early on in how you're designing solutions, as Helen and Anthony have spoken about. Could our panelists maybe share a little, and this is a question from the audience, what is happening across each sector, so public, private, even third sector, to promote the idea of the 50 city? And someone else has also been kind of calling out that for this to really work, we need people's mindset to shift, to move to shopping locally, walking to the train station, etc. So what needs to happen across each of these sectors to really promote that idea and build it into our thinking from the outset? Just jump in.
I'm happy to take that. I mean, the general shift in mindset is really interesting, and we've obviously been talking a lot today about transport for obvious reasons, but I think it goes to a kind of bigger shift in society around how we're seeing the climate emergency and how people's behaviours are changing around that. We try and build a kind of most sustainable level that we can, whether that's kind of passive house or edging towards passive house, or whether that's just way up on current building regs or even the future home standard. And we find that people who want to live in a house like that, most of the time don't want to have or do want to have a lifestyle that's kind of also associated with that. So why would you look to move into a house with really low energy bills that's super sustainable, but then at the same time have your kind of 3 Range Rovers parked out the front? You'll want to live in a kind of town centre or a kind of sustainable location where you can walk and cycle. And then if you provide those kind of those alternative modes that we've been talking about on top of that, then that's a good way of kind of tempting people along the road, essentially.
Yeah, I think I agree with James there as well. I think it's kind of selling the idea of a place rather than just all the kind of individual components that kind of makes the difference of, all these things can work together to achieve this kind of bigger goal. And I suppose that's how we've tried to sell it as the council, with the idea of, that the transport doesn't work in isolation. It can help contribute to your environmental sort of aspirations. It can help with your land use. It can help with your economy. There's so many different things that it touches on and enables, basically. What I think is quite interesting is, anecdotally, I've been hearing a lot more about the generation kind of coming up behind me and behind them, are really kind of distancing from this idea of ownership. So whereas I think we kind of grew up with the idea of, if you want to show you're successful, you buy your first car, and that's your status symbol. It seems to be very much now, a younger generation, the status symbol is the smartphone or the tablets. The idea of being connected is almost kind of more important than having that big sort of resource out there. And in a lot of ways, I suppose driving a car for them is a real hindrance, because it means that they can't then be streaming things, looking at things, speaking to their friends. So I think not only is the ownership model getting sort of distanced slightly with the idea of people buying cars on PCPs and sort of finance agreements, and the idea of kind of going over like a shared or not owning something kind of being an idea. The younger generation almost kind of don't want to own cars purely because it's more of a hindrance than it is a benefit to society for them.
That's really interesting. I think there's a streaming generation, they're talking, it's more of a streaming approach, isn't it? Not to own something, but to have access to it whenever you want it. I think I've heard that too. And hopefully not just from you before. I wanted to just talk about something which hasn't really been mentioned except tangentially, which is density. So density has a really big role to play in making a neighborhood sustainable, supporting amenities. If density isn't there, then you get this even more of a reliance on a car, because you can't support shops in your locality. So I think that one thing we're doing in our region is really trying to challenge that. It is difficult. It's politically not very popular to want higher densities, but it's something that, for example, the Goldsmith Street development in Norwich shows that how you can build quite densely but everyone has a front door, everyone has access to green space. So there's a really lovely space outside the front door. It doesn't mean, if it's bespoke design, it doesn't mean you're putting house types very, very close together with all the accompanying high level car ownership and the whole street becoming a car park. It needs to be designed specifically. You can't do that, I don't think, with house types unless you have kind of terraced house types. But it's really, really important, and I think that needs to start to be a part of the way forward.
Please go ahead, Anthony. I can see you raising your hand.
Yeah, manually I have to say. But no, some really good points there, Helen, again. I think in terms of design and house types, absolutely. Why not have terraced house types? And I think the density point you make is a really interesting one, which, as you rightly say, tends to raise blood pressure sometimes when you talk about higher densities. But it's quite interesting, I know from my own experience at public consultations, you start to ask people what they understand about density, and they very quickly sort of place linkages to high-rise blocks. You show alternative images, for example, of some Georgian squares, some traditional townscapes, and they all say, oh, well, that's really attractive. And you say, yeah, but here are the density figures. So density can be delivered in an attractive form, and that all goes back, to the broader placemaking piece. I think the only other point I'd make on the back of all of this is the link between transport and spatial planning. As we know, there's this constant tension, particularly where perhaps you have an absence of unitary authorities, where planning sits in one silo and transport in the other. And I do think for this type of debate to move forward positively, we need to see the two brought ever closer together.
No, absolutely, and all really, really valuable inputs. And I think calling out another common thread across the group and the questions that we're receiving is, on that communication side that we started in, it's clear there's not a one size fits all solution in how we get all stakeholders or even all end users on board with these solutions and all the various kind of other kind of levers that we need to pull around density and planning that help influence that. But how do we make sure, on that point of kind of not siloing each of these areas of thinking, how do we make sure that opportunity for tailoring carries over with enough flexibility in the frameworks that we have that enable and deliver these systems in the public realm? One audience member on the Q&A has really called this out, actually, and has stated, our residential and commercial infrastructure is just not fit for modern mobility. We need to think out of the box. So what are our speakers' views on this?
I think that's fundamentally right, if I might sort of jump in first there. I think really, this debate's a classic case in point that there's an awful lot of knowledge out there, both in public and private sector, but it's about leadership and an ability to actually demonstrate some of this fresh thinking. I think there's a sort of a real lead-lag dynamic at the moment, and it's a question of how are the opportunities going to arise, presumably via the private sector, but also with the assistance and partnering within the public sector. How are the opportunities going to arise where we can actually show that this isn't only a possibility, but it's actually a positive step forward? It's nothing to be feared. I think, as ever, people are fearful of change. We are talking about a fairly significant step change relative to what people have been used to, but it shouldn't be something to be afraid of. And I think it's all about that community engagement piece. How can we take people with us and lead by example?
I think from the sort of local authority side as well, mindful of the fact that we can make recommendations in a lot of cases, but a lot of the decisions are ultimately taken by the elected members in terms of what actually goes ahead in the city. So I suppose that's where consultation plays a big part. If we're kind of promoting new schemes, we've got to make sure that we're giving the public ample opportunity to be able to input their views. And then that's what we use as the evidence now in a lot of cases to go back to elected members. Because if they're then worried that, oh, if I make this decision, yeah, I think on paper it's the right thing to do, but I might be a vote loser. If we can then give them that confidence of, well, yeah, this is what the public actually want. It does fit with the objectives, and yeah, they're not worried about you taking away, for example, car provision on a certain street if they can see the wider benefits of it, and they see, well, actually, yeah, it's good for the city, it's good for the wider sort of place, and that evidence is there. Then it makes it so much easier. So I think, yeah, being able to actually use the public's views to kind of help make those decisions for the elected members is a big thing.
And I think that also speaks to the kind of wider shift in society that we've got going on at the minute. So with everyone being super focused on the climate emergency, I've noticed that is actually coming through to members who want to represent those people, and then they are able to kind of take those decisions. I think on the question of private and public, I think it's a really interesting group that we've got here today and in the chat as well on kind of the private sector can. We work a lot now in partnership on public sector land, working with councils to bring forward schemes that they put in really kind of ambitious policy requirements for, or they've put in some really kind of great guidance about how that comes forward, which helps developers and with private funding in order to take the planning risk away, which is super handy. And I think the other kind of part of it is where like the private market car club providers, EV charging point providers are kind of innovating, and that their products are getting cheaper and better, that when they start feeding into the equation as well, actually, this is all moving in quite a good direction with a lot of tools that aren't particularly that new.
Just one observation from the COVID pandemic, from our point of view, that patterns have already started to change. That as people in sort of smaller communities around the edge of city centres, as they've started to open up new shops, new cafes in their communities, we've noticed that the uptake of car share in those areas has lifted, because people aren't doing their regular commute into the city centre. They're staying within their communities. They're using the facilities more, and that's changed the pattern of our usage. So although we've got a structure that's been set without town shopping and facilities in city centres, it can change. I mean, it's changing organically. We don't know how permanent it's going to be, but it has already shifted.
No, I think we're getting a clear message here as well, that kind of at that early stage, at the consultation stage, and in the face and up against the private car lobby, and we know is very powerful, we should be really leaning into the public, what they're calling for, the reality of the climate crisis, and really kind of hammering those messages home in taking these forward. And I think we spent quite a lot of our discussion looking at that early stage, the consultation, how you put this into planning. But one of the things that came through in our discussion as a group ahead of this was the long-term thinking element of this as well, and building in the responsibility for delivery. So if we maybe just end there talking about the level of responsibility across the three sectors, or collaboratively in the delivery phase, to ensure that the solutions that we've consulted early, planned early, are then actually really looked after and are delivering the results that we want to see.
Happy to take that one. I think like all of those things, essentially, in the most simplistic way, they obviously directly lead into the delivery phase. And if you've already struck up those kind of partnerships during the planning phase, then it makes it a lot easier to do so. It's really interesting hearing about the Aberdeen policy on car clubs, which I think should be shared kind of nationwide as such a fantastic policy, because if something like that's not there in for delivery, then it's up to kind of developers to find their own car clubs or to strike up their own partnerships, and maybe that's like a barrier for people not doing it. Whereas if that is directly involved, then it's kind of happy days for everybody.
Yeah, and I'd say that's one of the reasons why we put forward Aberdeen as an example, because we wished every council, every city we were operated in had the same sort of structured system. it will make our job so much more easier as a deliverer to just to make it more sustainable, because we can see the potential in a lot of areas and it's never fully realised, and we can try and grow it organically, but it will just grow so much more slowly. So to up the pace, I think a structure like this is really needed to really help us deliver.
I think from a council perspective, it's sort of getting the context right in terms of, what we expect developers, members of the public to be potentially doing, but also at the same time, it's looking far enough ahead that we're thinking, well, we need to plan for this. Therefore, how can we make sure that our policies, plans, strategies have enough built in that there is an onus put on developers to kind of get things in from the start and early before it's not too late. But at the same time, I suppose, kind of make it flexible enough that we're not then nailing all our colours to one particular mast. And you're almost, technology overtakes you and then you find that you've got an out-of-date standard. So it's definitely getting that balance. On top of that as well, it's then, I suppose, going out and maybe setting up some contracts for things in such a way that it kind of gives the public confidence that something hasn't just sort of arrived in the city without any sort of prior kind of notification. The council has been a part in making something kind of operational and something happen. And in the case of the car club, we effectively put the contract out every 3 years with a potential extension up to 5, basically. So that we're effectively inviting a car club operator to come into Aberdeen and run that service for up to a 5-year period. And there's then certain criteria and certain things that we expect them to do as part of that service. So again, we've got to be thinking far enough ahead of, right, are we making sure that we're effectively looking at what the picture could be like in 5 years? But at the same time, we're kind of giving the public the confidence that, yes, we have properly assessed these operators that are coming in. And at the same time, we've been quite clear about what we expect them to do.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for your thoughts, everyone. And I think, just to wrap us today, I think there are some real common themes or key takeaways that we can all take from the discussion so far, and what a fantastic discussion it's been. But that need for cross collaboration across all sectors is definitely coming through strongly, building into the public realm for the outset and capturing people early on in their decision making, the thinking long term and building in responsibility for delivery, but in providing enough flexibility there to allow for new innovation and responsiveness to changes in the public domain. The wider view and that kind of broader view that needs to be taken on the transport mix, the infrastructure that's there, playing a role in all of these options that we have to move people towards sustainable transport. And with that, making sure that we're tailoring that approach, speaking to people's motivations, addressing negative perceptions, addressing disparities in how we put these measures forward. So thank you all for providing such useful insights, both on the kind of philosophical and practical level for everyone here today, and the lively discussion that's happened in the chat, the Q&A, and the participation in the polls from the audience. It's been a really fantastic session. I'm personally very excited about following up with each of our speakers here today on some potential collaborative projects ahead. So thank you, everyone. There will now be a short lunch break in the session, so everyone can visit the exhibitor booths for live Q&A with company reps. The information is up on screen now, so do feel free to ask in the chat if you have any questions. You can head there directly to meet sponsors and other COMO representatives such as myself, who will be on hand to answer any questions. So thanks again for joining our session today, and see you this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.